Welcome to the Salem Athenaeum, and thanks for joining us for what promises to be a fascinating program. Before we start, if you could make sure that you're muted through the presentation, but if you do have questions afterwards for our two guests, please put those in the chat feature that appears either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you're using. University of Connecticut Professor Emeritus Robert Gross specializes in the social and cultural history of the United States, from colonial times right up through the 19th century. His first book on the American Revolution, The Minutemen and Their World, 1976, won the Bancroft Prize in American History and will be published next year in a new revised edition that commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. Professor Gross joins us tonight to discuss the Transcendentalists and their world, another of his books in which the town of Concord plays a leading role. We'll hear about the concepts of individual freedom and democratic equality that iconic thinkers such as Thoreau and Emerson espoused in their lifetimes and that still resonate in ours. Dr. Gross is joined in conversation tonight by Arthur Riss, an associate professor of English at Salem State University and author of Race, Slavery, and Liberalism in 19th Century American Literature. Please welcome Professors Robert Gross and Arthur Riss.
Thank you. And thanks to the Athenaeum for inviting me to talk to Bob Gross about his magisterial book. And thanks to Professor Gross for writing it. So I guess I'll begin with the obvious question, right? You're so deeply identified with Concord. No one can mention the word Concord, it seems, without nod in your direction, literally, metaphorically, both. So I want to ask the question, why Concord? And I'm tempted to ask it a little differently, since where we are virtually, why not Salem? But is there something unique about Concord that you think drew your focus?
Well, first, let me say thanks to the Salem Athenaeum for hosting this event. I have particularly warm feelings about Salem since on February 29th of this past year, I went to a dinner party in 2020, went to a dinner party in Salem, and then everything shut down a week later. And so I now associate Salem with freedom. I'm speaking to you from my home in Concord, Massachusetts. So you'd have some sense that I'm not out in some ether here, but sitting in Concord, place I studied, but not where I grew up. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. If you take Bridgeport, basically an immigrant industrial city, the way, similar to the way Salem, Lynn developed, it would look to many people like the exact opposite of Concord, Massachusetts, which is often a stand-in for the ideal New England town. And that's worth thinking about, not only for the kind of ways in which we view America in mythical terms and what we see as our ideal places and the ones we'd rather not live in. It's particularly important because Concord was settled by groups of English Puritans, some of whom left after about 15 years, and they went to settle in Fairfield, Connecticut, in the section right near where I grew up in Bridgeport. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that Concord and Bridgeport, or Fairfield, Concord and Salem, are in many ways part of a same universe that took different plots owing to different economic opportunities and the like. Anyway, so I say that because to answer Arthur's question, why Concord, is to say to you that I didn't begin out of some hometown desire, or I'm not an aficionado of local history. I came to say Concord because I wanted to write about New England communities and about America, but to do so in places that wouldn't just be case studies of general processes, or wouldn't be places of nostalgia. I mean, presumably as a writer, I could have made money writing books of nostalgia. But what I was really interested in doing is writing about communities, a community like Concord, where important things happened. And I could simultaneously talk about uh, the way in which the processes of change took place, whether they were how people in Concord came to mobilize against British rule, and how Concord's responses became consequential for a larger history. So in looking at the Minutemen, what I'm really asking is, how did the revolution come to Concord? Which is a question that really presumes that there's an ongoing history of a community into which the events of British policies and resistance to them occur, and British revocation of the Massachusetts Charter, which stirs the revolution, takes place. But then in turn, what's the impact of the revolution on the town itself and its history? So too, I'm really asking why Concord, why did it become both a kind of the seat of and symbol for the movement we call Transcendentalism? Or you might say more broadly, how did Concord become for a time America's first center of literary and intellectual culture with an American and worldwide resonance? You know, when you think about it, there are not many places that become such world cities. You know, Concord could become a UNESCO historical site. But there are not many places. You can think, you know, Plato's Athens and Florence of the Renaissance of Michelangelo. You can think of Goethe and Weimar. Concord was that America. So I want to understand how and why that became that came about. It's not that I think Concord was the only place where noted intellectuals lived. It's this actually broadly a Boston area phenomenon, the American Renaissance. But nonetheless, the point of both books is to probe how, you know, that the answer to the question why Concord becomes an answer to larger questions about New England, about the North, and about America.
You talk about Concord being a place where important things happen, and you know, like as you're careful to point out, right? It's a place of two revolutions. You call the advent of transcendentalism the second shot heard around the world, but you also want to talk about the difference between the kind of political revolution and the literary intellectual revolution. And I wonder if you could talk about the kind of transition, this community that you're interested in.
Right. So there actually have been two answers to the question, why Concord, in terms of transcendentalism. The first has been that the Minutemen fired the shots for American political independence, and the Transcendentalists picked up the muskets, metaphorically, and fired the shots for American intellectual independence. I think that's a pretty problematic notion for a couple of reasons. First, nobody has ever really explained how the Transcendentalists, working out the logic of the Minutemen, how they got the memo. How did they know and discover that it would be their generational task to fulfill the unfulfilled legacy of the Minutemen? But secondly, the legacies are different. You know, the Minutemen, it seems to me, I argue in the Minutemen in their world, sought to defend collective self-rule. What triggered their uprising against the British Parliament and Crown was the revocation of the Charter of Massachusetts and the imposition of what we call the coercive or the intolerable acts, which barred every Massachusetts town from holding town meetings without the governor's consent, except once a year when they elected municipal officers. And you'd have to have the agenda approved by the governor. That was an invasion of community and infringement on local autonomy that to the generation of 1775 essentially threatened the entire way of life of a New England town. But the Transcendentalists were not mesmerized by the American Revolution, nor thinking in terms of continuing the American Revolution. They were speaking for freeing the individual from collective restraints, from releasing the holds of tradition, and freeing people from the ancestor worship that went in Concord for endless talk about the heroes of 1775, and enabling people to realize an individual possibility that was guaranteed to them by virtue of a new understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human.
Yeah, as again, you also say in the book, right? People have been asking, what is transcendentalism? I don't understand what transcendentalism is from the very beginning. And you seem to have a very kind of clear account of it as this moment when, communal ties are unraveling in locally, disestablishment of religion, collapse of fraternal organizations, private schools, political division, all these things, leading to this new emphasis on the individual. So I just wonder if you could talk about that, more about like what transcendentalism is, since it's such, my undergraduates always ask, and I never know what to say.
Right. Well, that's a great question. And it follows from the way in which I purposely ended the last sentence.
Right. Well, yeah, it's amazing how that happens.
Yeah, you picked up the loose thread. So the question, what is transcendentalism, has been asked not only by one generation of students after another, actually one survey class in American literature after another. Not only has it been asked there, but it was asked from the moment that what we call transcendentalism burst upon the intellectual scene, first in the Boston area and then more broadly in the United States, start in the early 1830s to the late 1830s, early 1840s. And the question, what is transcendentalism, was pressed with great urgency by people who couldn't stand what they thought were the ideas of the transcendentalists. The reason they asked, what is transcendentalism? Tell us what you mean by that, is they rejected the very terms by which Emerson and Thoreau and George Ripley and Orestes Brownson, Frederick Henry Hedge, all, except for Thoreau, Unitarian ministers of a liberal sort, the way they had conceived it. And that's because what they wanted to do was to argue that within every human being, within all creation, is a spirit of divinity. It's part and parcel of the very constitution of nature, human and non-human. So where's this big idea come from? And why is it a big idea in the 1830s? Well, the big idea is coming from German romantics, from German scholars of the Bible, from British and French idealists, who are all coming together in the notion that religion is something more than the institutional church or a Bible or dogma. They have the sense that in a world of pluralism, various religious sects compete with one another. And if you were to stand back from what's on offer, you would probably say, as Emerson and George Ripley, the minister, said to people, religion can't be a place, a dwelling, a house of worship. You can worship God in a cathedral or outdoors. It can't be a form of governance. You got the papacy with its elaborate hierarchy. You've got independent congregations in Massachusetts, all of whom can act on their own. And you've got Quaker meetings. So it can't be that. It can't be doctrine. Some Christian sects think sprinkle a little water and you can baptize. Others think you got to put the whole body and immerse it. Others think it's just a symbol. You don't really have to do it at all. So what's religion? And what the Transcendentalists come to is the notion that religion is a divine spirit. When I look out at the people here in the gallery view, to whom I want to say hello, I can see that Ross Martin, who's looking at me, and Carol Solomon. You might be thinking, what is religion? And I would say, we might say you all share a common human nature. But the Transcendentalists would say, no, you all share a common divinity and not just a common humanity. And in that divinity, you have access to something of God. And why should we believe this claim? Because we all have religious sentiments within us. Go out in nature, sit by a brook on a beautiful day, or stare up at the sky, look at the stars. And human beings tend to be awestruck and feeling there's got to be something larger, there's something there. Emerson says that's the religious sentiment. And the only way you can have such a religious sentiment is if you were endowed by your creator with the capacity to intuit it. Hence, you don't even need experience or lectures or dogma to tell you this. You already know it. And you already know that there's a morality built within the universe. You know when people lie and deceive and betray their own better selves. So what the Transcendentalists are doing is trying to urge you to come to feel that deeper inner self, which is spiritual. And when it comes to raising children, you know that every infant born is something new under the sun. Everyone looks at the newborn child and says, there's infinite possibility there. Or at least so that's become an American and Western and maybe worldwide creed. And Emerson is involved in making that creed the basis of a new understanding of society. That no longer will we say that it was the purpose of society to put its prosperity ahead of any individual. We sacrifice the individual to the state. But now, says Emerson, we know that it is for the education and guardianship of every individual that society is organized. So from this perspective, they're offering something new. And let me add one other thing and bring this to a brief close. And that is, why should this be articulated in the 1830s? Mm-hmm. Because in 1832-33, it's become clear that the Massachusetts religious establishment, which every town is required to establish a congregation, hire a minister, take care of the meeting house, pay for it, and people are taxed for that. It's coming apart. This is the last state in the Union in which there is a mandated religious establishment. And as it's clear that this is not going to last, a number of liberal Protestants, future Unitarians they'll call themselves, are basically arguing we need a strategy to compete for members of our congregation in the new world of pluralism. And what I've just laid out for you in a way to view religion is that strategy. Speak to the soul, not to dogma, not to church discipline, not to the house of worship. You don't want to compete by saying, well, they got a newer meeting house than you. We got stained glass windows. You want to compete for the soul by appealing to the soul within.
I want to follow up on that, but I was just struck when you were talking about, the big idea of divinity in every person and, talking about it so eloquently. There's a way you write that is all about returning the divinity to details. And I just wonder how you think about, the relationship between a detail, whether it's Thoreau's beans. I mean, you talk about Thoreau's beans pretty, almost as humorously as Thoreau does. And how you talk about this, relationship between a very concrete detail and very big ideas.
Right. So what I was getting at is in the writing of the book, as both a social history and an intellectual history, I'm trying to convey the lived experience of individuals. I don't just want to give you an abstract account of the changing social order of New England and the different institutions that came into being. I think I have original things to say about that. And I probably could have said that in a shorter book. But my feeling has always been as a historian that we need to know how people live in experience and enact in their own ways the large forces that you're obliged to read about and memorize for exams in history classes. In fact, you asked this in a way that makes me think, if every child is something new under the sun, then every person is something new in history. Mm. And my ethic as a historian is to try to capture that. So that means that I want to not only tell you about the large things happening, some of which are contradictions in social values and political practice, some of which are like slavery and racism, contradictions of professed belief in equality and democracy and actual exclusions of people from any real possibility in the so-called new nation. If I want to write about that, I don't want to just tell you that in general. I want you to see how people felt and lived and experienced their lives. Because it seems to me that people do so by reinventing, if you will, society and politics in their own lives, even when it would appear that they are subordinate. Let me give you an example that will make this less abstract. I have a lot to say about the church in Concord and religious conflict, but also how Ezra Ripley, the step-grandfather of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the established minister of Concord from 1778 to 1841, I have a lot to say about how he carries out his job. This was a man who, on taking up the pulpit in Concord, really believed that he was at one and the same time what the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 prescribed as the public Protestant teacher of piety, religion, and morality. And he was also the ambassador of Christ to the Christians under his charge. Ripley carried out this mission as if he were an English country vicar, in which he saw all the people in town, whether they wanted him or not, they were going to have to pay taxes for him in the parish. And he saw them as what he said is my people. He married the couples, he baptized the children, and he baptized the infants, he catechized the children. He would, in turn, write letters of recommendation for them if they wanted to become school teachers or tavern keepers. He would write letters supporting Concord people who were in the state prison. He would appeal for pardons for them. This was a man who intruded in every aspect of his people's lives. And I could tell you that generally, but you'll come to really grasp it through the felt and lived experience of Ezra Ripley and the parishioners. So to me, a social history of religion is also a cultural and intellectual history, but you can only know it by both reading the church records, figuring out who were parishioners who left behind letters and diaries, but also, and this is something maybe Arthur wants to get at, I also did a quantitative study of who joined the church and at what age, and how many were women and how many were men. And what you find out when you do that is that 70 to 75% of the church members in Concord were women. And this was true in the 18th century. It was true through the first half of the 19th century. It was true for the Unitarians. It was true for the evangelical Congregationalists. And why would you want to know this? Partly because they'll tell you about New England religion, but also tell you about society in a world where women were subordinated, subject to the laws of coverture, where they couldn't, once married, couldn't make contracts in their own right, couldn't, if they earned wages, couldn't keep the money, couldn't vote, couldn't serve on trial juries. In such a world, the number of choices that women could really make were few and far between. One of a husband, often a choice that's really a veto of who their father picked out. And secondly, whether to join the church or not and see to their own spiritual fates. In such a world, to write a history of religion is also to write a history of women. And we'll see this in the book as you read on and discover that the women who joined the church joined the Concord Female Charitable Society in 1814, used that as a vehicle to increase their presence and assertiveness in the community. And a good many of those women were founders of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. So to answer your question, I think it's that to write a social history is to bring you into the intimate lives of people so that you can understand the choices they made and the ones they didn't make. And that leads you back to the ideas they embrace. Let me just finish this up by saying, one of the things I found myself learning anew as I wrote the book is that most histories go wrong when they simply recount what people did in the past. They don't tell you what choices people made within the frames that were available to them that led to the things they did in the past. And if you can reconstruct the framework of choices and limitations within which people exist, then you can make the things you're describing lively and compelling.
There's a lot I want to follow up on that. I want to talk about women and Emerson's interest in the manliness, and yet women attending, and being deeply involved in transcendentalist thought. I also want to talk about Ezra Ripley, who is like the foil in your story. He's like, I feel so bad for him half the time because he's like, trying to push against the tide of the transcendental thought. And the moment you have when you describe him preaching his last sermon is pretty moving. But it's all tied to this idea that, as you said, there's a very strong ethic driving your work. And as much as you say that's tied to, the historical moment in a very specific historical place, I think we talked about this yesterday, I'm just struck by how Trump haunts your book and that kind of, the kind of ethic that drives you. I just want to, if I can I read a section that I found quite striking, because it's not really advertised, but it's very powerful. This is from your preface. Over the last few years, as I wrote the bulk of these pages, Concord and Massachusetts in the mid-19th century have seemed uncannily close to the United States in our own time. The issues with which we struggle today, fake news, electoral fraud, sloganeering, personal attacks, and conspiracy theories, drove the partisans and sectarians of small town Concord into mutually suspicious enclaves. Yet confidence in progress remained high, far more so than it does today. And I found that quite a moving moment because, the paranoia, the lack of any sense of futurity and progress is quite striking today. And I just wonder how you thought about those two moments.
I'm glad you reread those. The preface, for those of you who haven't written a book, is usually the last thing you write, but it's the first thing the reader reads. And so you can't write the preface till you've finished, so you know what the book's about. And yeah, I've worked on this book for so long that its origins lie long before we ever heard about Donald Trump. And yet, any book, as you're writing it, has to have an implicit audience. And the audience is not people who lived in the 1970s or 80s. It's people who are living today who will read and buy and be, I hope, excited by and entertained by and informed by and provoked by what I've had to say. And I was acutely aware of two things. One, that Ezra Ripley spoke for an ethic of interdependence, a sense that all of us are bound together in this world, that we need each other to get by, that nobody lives for himself alone. As Ripley would put it, only a disgusted hermit or half-crazed enthusiast would say to society, "I have no need of thee." I love that hermit. It anticipates his parishioner, Henry David Thoreau, living alone at Walden. So, there's this ethic of interdependence that is going to be challenged by Emerson and Thoreau's individualism, Thoreau living alone. And yet, and this is the paradox I was really thinking about, why is New England so blue? Blue, perhaps in a psychological sense of the blues as much as the current map of red and blue. But why is it that we have watched, even through this pandemic, the New England states have come together in pushing vaccinations and succeeding in persuading the population, however libertarian Maine and New Hampshire are compared to, say, Vermont and Connecticut? It's quite remarkable. So, and likewise, rates of violence and homicide in New England have always been much lower than in most of the rest of the country. So there's something in the political culture that I was trying to get at here. But I don't think that's the only thing. I also think that what I show in the book is that, as unlikely as you might think it, Concord, as it became democratic in a political sense, as it was subject to the rising forces of popular democracy, experienced what Arthur described, a kind of partisan sloganeering in which, you had two different party papers and it would be like Fox News and MSNBC. Nobody ever, read both. Nobody ever looked for, and what you knew about the opponent is what your own partisan organ would tell you. You had a newspaper editor who wanted to expose the Masonic conspiracy in Concord. He became an anti-Mason, and the opponents organized a subscription boycott. They canceled advertisements in his newspaper. They did everything they could to bankrupt the guy. They called in his mortgage loans. Meanwhile, he felt threatened and announces in the newspaper, "By the way, folks, I'm carrying weapons if anybody challenges me on the streets." And you got conspiracy theory. When I reflect on it, I think that every major moment of large-scale democratization in American history is a moment that sees this kind of political upheaval. An upheaval in which, the question is, can you democratize in society that lacks the bonds of trust between people? And you began, I think, rightly reading that passage. I said people were torn apart, but they all believed in progress. Mm-hmm. We're torn apart, and we face climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do want to talk about that more too, because the end of the book makes me think about collective political action, but you just talked about the utopian kind of impulse, the progressive movement, which I think, since it's a Salem Athenaeum, we have to bring up Hawthorne around now to make sure we get to some Hawthorne stuff. But because that's what's striking about Hawthorne. I think you say that Concord was a magnet for those who were disappointed and disillusioned in Brook Farm, And of course, Hawthorne moved to Concord after his kind of, experiment with utopian progressive thought. And of course, there he became friends with Thoreau. I mean, it seemed like he was talking across political positions. And I just wondered if you could talk more about Hawthorne and his.
Well, it's funny. Hawthorne was remembered by some as the myth, the guy who comes to Concord, lives in the manse, which comes to be known as the old manse, thanks to him.
Right.
And nobody knows who's the stranger, what's he doing there? And that's not really true. He socialized a good bit. He visited with Emerson, whom at times he couldn't bear. He thought Emerson had a kind of lofty manner about himself, and was always standing at a lectern. He rode along the Concord River with Thoreau, bought his boat from him. He walked into town regularly, had to pick up the mail at the post office, and knew a lot of people, which is to say that for Hawthorne, as for Emerson and Thoreau, the great advantage of the small town is it enabled contact across social classes. For as much as I described people pulling apart from one another, they weren't really pulling apart so much that nobody knew each other. And that's a crucial phenomenon of the time, because Emerson would look at this, and Hawthorne too, would look at the cities and see the rise of mass society, see a world where political democracy really took shape in mass parades in which tens of thousands of people who supported one or another candidate would march through the streets of a city. Think about what a little bit you might remember from school of the election of 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and people, these grand parades which took place in Concord as well. Emerson looked at that, looked at the big conventions full of hundreds of delegates, and he said, here's a world in which the individual is being absorbed into the mass. But in Concord, you can still see the individual. So come back to Hawthorne, he's aware of the same phenomena as Emerson is, the globalization of capitalism, the rise of popular democracy, or we might say populist democracy and mass political parties, the rise of voluntary societies devoted to progress, to getting everybody to stop doing what their fathers did and adopt the latest fashions and science of the days and best practices. And people who were also engaged in benevolent societies that became large bureaucracies that promoted reforms in the region, the North, the nation as a whole. You are all getting in your email, I'm sure, solicitations from big national and international charities for your donations at this time of year. Hawthorne watched that world being born of large-scale benevolence and charities. You got all those phenomena. Hawthorne's as aware of them as Thoreau is, as Emerson is. But unlike the Transcendentalists, Hawthorne had no interest in expanding the individual self into a grand force. Because when he looked at the individual, he didn't see one soul of divinity. He saw one corrupt person, full of as much capacity for evil as good. And while Hawthorne was not interested in conversion and classical Calvinism, he saw people who should not be encouraged to live out their fantasy of they're born again and now perfect. And so sitting in the old man's, Nathaniel Hawthorne writes a number of short stories, 15 of them in those years were published in different magazines and often reprinted in the Concord newspaper. He writes stories in which, within the frame of Mosses from an Old Man's, he lays out the schemes of really crackpot perfectionists and utopians, of husbands who are doctors who want to get rid of the one little blemish on their wife's skin so that they would really be perfect. he knows that that way leads disaster. And he ends up seeing the manse as a place of ghosts. It's a great irony. The Hawthornes rent the manse in Concord 9 months after Ezra Ripley has died. It's a house built somewhere between 1767 and 1770. But by the magic of his writing, Hawthorne turns his house into not a 70-year-old place on the real estate market, but this manse from the mists of time, whose gate is broken down and who inhabited by ghosts. Maybe Ezra Ripley is there looking over his shoulder. And then he's looking out at the North Bridge where the revolution took place. But he's interested in the grave of the British soldier. And most of all, he thinks, you know, there was once an Indian village by the river here in Concord. And what he ends up doing is creating the manse and Concord as a place that is not so much pastoral, but embodies kind of modesty, a kind of limitation, a restraint. None of the crazy utopianism that will lead him to imagine the Transcendentalists as wanting to take a celestial railroad to heaven. Instead, Concord will be a kind of bucolic place where you can go to escape the modern railroad-driven age of hectic profit-seeking, political scheming. And so he ends up merging with the Transcendentalist love of nature to create an image of Concord as a place you go to, not like Salem on Halloween, but for the rest of the year, a place where you go to have a retreat from the modern, confusing 19th century.
It's okay if I ask one more question, because I know we want to get to.
I think, yeah, we
okay,
have a lot of
because
questions.
I was just very, talking about what he, the different account of the individual that Hawthorne shared with the Transcendentalists. But I was also thinking about the way your book ends, the moment where it ends, where Emerson is, becoming a national figure. You talk about Thoreau writing Walden, and you call it, it's a great term you use, the quintessential Concord-American book. Transcendentalism, or the at least those figures, are becoming bigger than Concord. But there's also another thing that I'm not sure if I read something into it, but as they're kind of moving out of Concord, you also seem to suggest they're moving, as they become more engaged in radical reform, especially Emerson in anti-slavery politics. This kind of fear of lost individuality in the pursuit of reform, this kind of sense of a betrayal of transcendentalism seems to come as they begin to realize interdependence is necessary in order to have collective political action against something as big as slavery. When you mentioned climate change today, and I just wonder about that. Is that fair to say there's something going on that as they became increasingly political, increasingly invested in collective action, they somehow became less transcendental?
I'm not sure. Greta, what's her last name? The Swedish young activist.
Oh, Greta Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg. Is she maybe not the Henry Thoreau defending John Brown? Is she not embodying for us the sole individual who says, come on, don't we all know what's happening? Are we going to let an older generation betray our future? Greta Thunberg's self-appointed sense of mission is as an individual speaking for the collective. One could argue, and I wouldn't want to push this too far, that Thoreau might have seen himself the same way when he spoke up for John Brown, when he laid out his case for civil disobedience. And yet, it's also true that neither John Brown consulted anybody larger. Well, he did consult abolitionists, but ultimately made his own plans. Thoreau, when he goes to jail to protest the Mexican War, he hasn't told anybody. It seems perhaps it was an impulsive decision, but it was never covered in the newspapers. It came and went with little effect, except that we later read what he had to say. I think that one historical answer to the question you raise is that the Transcendentalist movement as movement really covers the years from about 1835 to 45. By then, everybody's dispersed. Margaret Fuller's going off to Europe to cover the Italian revolutions. Theodore Parker has got an independent congregation in Boston. Brook Farm's going to break up. There's no real movement. Moreover, the basic ideas have been formulated. People are now enacting them. That's not a criticism, but it is a problem for a book that's asking, why does Concord matter? I didn't want to write about Concord to say, you know, they had an abolitionist movement here. Well, yeah, we know that was true in many places. You'd want to say, well, what was distinctive about the movement in Concord? Well, actually, I think I could argue not all that much. You know, why do I say that? Well, the Garrisonian abolitionists in Concord, mostly women, took up petitions written by the leaders of the movement in Boston or New York, carried them from door to door for signatures. The text of the petitions was written in New York. The very idea of the petition campaign was conceived in Boston or New York. The only thing that was actually original to Concord was the names of were the signatures. Mm-hmm. If you think about it that way, you're writing a history not of what's distinctive about the place, but what the place has in common with all the other places. And one of my themes is how Concord goes from being, in important ways, an independent, self-confident and autonomous New England town to being integrated into the wider world in ways that are like other places. Imagine if you walked into Harvard Square in 2001 or two, and somebody said, you want to sign a petition for John Kerry for a president? And you signed it. You live in Salem, but you happened to be in Cambridge that day, so you signed it. And a historian wanted to study all the people in Cambridge who were for John Kerry. Well, in fact, what you learned is there was nothing about Cambridge or Salem that was distinct. It was a larger political force. So when the Transcendentalists reform ideas merge into a larger force, that's a story, but not necessarily a story about Concord. Mm-hmm. So I end the book when what's really distinctive about Concord and its writers has reached a point, not of end, obviously they're continuing to act, but a point of distinctiveness to write about.
Well, I want to turn to audience questions, there are a lot, but I have like so many more questions for you, so I'm not sure.
Call later.
Yeah, there we go. But I just like to just some of the questions that get in the chat. Just begin with one of them. Your book gives prominence, this is from Ross Martin, to two high priests of Transcendentalism, Emerson and Thoreau. Who do you feel gets most often left out of the story of Transcendentalism?
Well, for a long time, but no more, Margaret Fuller and the Peabody sisters, especially Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. But thanks to Megan Marshall's work, her account of Margaret Fuller won the Pulitzer Prize. Her account of the Peabody sisters is really well known, and more and more people are aware of the role of women in Transcendentalism. A new book has just come out that argues that there were a good number of Black abolitionists as well, Black Transcendentalists as well, who believed that there was a higher law that mattered most of all, tied to the divine soul. I haven't finished reading it yet, so I don't know if I'm persuaded. I think we don't know much about ordinary farmers, white folk, laborers. We don't know how immigrants viewed this. I tried as much as I could to tell the story of responses to Emerson and Thoreau and Transcendentalism in Concord. And what I found is the best records come from people who are college educated or academy educated, that is, in a broad way, in the privileged classes. And Emerson comes out of the privileged classes, though his father died when he was about 8 years old, and the mother had to keep a boarding house. And so there wasn't actually a lot of money. There was a kind of cultural capital, maybe some social capital people they had access to, but not a lot of money there. That was one of the things, Ross, that I had to really rethink in the book. And that's what do we mean by elite? What do we mean by common people? In a world where there's clearly privilege, but most people aren't going to college. Most people, there can be lots of people who read widely, care about culture, maybe had a term or two in a private academy, but that's about it. And yet really matter here. I think that was a world where, going well into the 20th century, lots of people who had primary school or later high school education were nonetheless quite intellectual, interested in reading. Anecdote from Concord is I've known people and known about people who spent the Great Depression in the Concord Public Library reading Emerson and Thoreau. They're probably the same city in Salem reading Hawthorne. So in the Black community, I would have once been passed over by scholars. And I'm not alone. There are others who have recovered the small Black community in Concord of roughly 2 to 3 dozen people at any one time, and try to understand the ways in which they're living in the town from slavery to the eve of the Civil War. And there, the crucial thing I would just say is that in the period from 1790 to 1850, most New England country towns are whitening. That is, their Black populations have died off or have moved away. In Concord, that population remains 2 to 3 dozen strong through 1850. And the share of the population, the Blacks represent about 1 to 1.5 to 2%, which is actually the percentage in the state as a whole in those years. So people are making a decision to stay in Concord. And part of the goal there was to recover why they wanted to stay, given the absence of any large Black community in which you could raise kids and people could form their own churches. The period from the mid-1820s to the 1850s is one that I see as an increasing integration of Black people into everyday life in the town.
Diane asks, I understand that Emerson was invited to speak in Salem, but he declined.
Well, he declined once. I believe he spoke on other occasions, but the time he declined, he was invited to speak, and the person who wrote the invitation said, so long as you avoid any controversial subjects regarding politics or religion. And by the way, is the mayor of Salem here in the audience? I often hear her on WGBH pass this on. Emerson said, I'm sorry, but I cannot accept an invitation that comes with such restrictions.
Are there any other questions that I can, because I know we have reached kind of the time.
There's Victoria has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Victoria.
I did put this in chat. I have not read your book, Professor Gross, but I just wanted to go back to your point I'm really curious about this, about Ripley and the Orthodox, the more Puritan Congregationalists kind of being analogous to the Trumpsters. Are you arguing that?
No. What I
Okay.
am saying is that the libertarianism, not a term used at the time, that Emerson and Thoreau profess, in which they put the cultivation of the individual before the state, could look superficially to resemble the libertarianism of today. But I don't think it's the same.
Okay.
The libertarianism that Emerson and Thoreau are professing is to challenge the hold of tradition of hierarchy and constraint on the individual. And they were looking at a world in which the state had characteristically been a monarchy and aristocracy that sacrificed the individual to its own goals, or was paternalistic and used its power to reward some businesses with tariffs and punish others, to put high taxes on some and favor others. And in such a world, a weak state is a democratic state because it rests upon, and in Emerson's and Thoreau's view, a democratic society is one that has a fundamental trust in the individual as the moral actor and citizen. And what was the case in the first half of the 19th century is a great many people were challenging the restrictions of the state over their economic activity, over their choice of religion, and a whole lot of other realms of life. But they didn't make much of a case for why. They simply said every individual has the right to pursue his own self-interest. Maybe if they read Adam Smith, they would say, and an invisible hand will solve it all. They might say an individual has a right to choose his own religion and embrace his own deity. And if you're born again, maybe we should trust you. What the Transcendentalists and the Romantics really did was to impute an idealism to their idea of the individual, to imagine that every individual has within this divine spirit that will enable people to act on a higher morality. And that higher morality will in fact serve and save the society as a whole. When Thoreau is arguing in his essay that we call Civil Disobedience for the right of individuals to dissent and challenge the law when they think it's immoral, he says, don't we need a few people to stand and point out to us our social failures, our contradictions of our deepest values? Why do they always kill Galileo? Why do they suppress Copernicus? We need a few people standing on the wall to alarm us when things have gone wrong. So that's a vision of the individual operating on his own, but with a social audience in mind. The libertarianism of the present is really for some, not all, but for some, libertarianism that doesn't see any obligation to society, but just to the self. I hope, does that make sense to you?
Yes, I'm a Unitarian minister, and I've focused my scholarship on the 17th century Puritanism and the through line through the 19th century to today. And I thought, he's not really saying that about Ripley's generation, is he? So thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your book.
Well, I think on that note, unless there are further questions, I think we'll end the program. But many thanks to Professors Gross and Riss. This was fascinating. And I must say, I'm not quite through the book yet, but it is wonderful. And this is what it looks like. And we have a link to the book in our chat feature. Oh my goodness. Is this, oh, I know, because I'm going to have to put it here. Okay, because I have the blur in the
There you
back.
go. There you
Anyway,
go.
oh, cool, thank you.
It's appropriate you have a copy right there.
Well-
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And 200 of the pages are notes. This is such an incredibly researched and scholarly tome. Is just wonderful. It's well worth the read. It's really, I thought it was written like a narrative, and very accessible. It's not like a textbook. It's just fascinating. Anyway, it's certainly available at your favorite bookstore through bookshop.org and Amazon. And again, we have the link in our chat feature. To our audience, we'll continue the conversation next month, January 19th, with the authors of 2 new historical fiction books in which Concord is again the star. Don Zancanella wrote the book appropriately named Concord, and Kate Dyke Blair is the author of The Hawthorne Inheritance. They'll be in conversation again on January 19th, and we invite you to join us. Thanks again to all of you, to all of the members, and to all of the attendees tonight. We really appreciate your support of the Salem Athenaeum. I want to wish you a happy holiday and a very healthy, happy new year. And again, thanks to our guests tonight. Good night.
Good night.
Great. Thank you.